Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be challenging the U.S. justice system statistically and economically. Now, topics such as capital punishment, the privatization of prisons, and drug sentences are all seemingly rooted in an ethical context, but a more underlying problem that we've discovered is the economic consequences of these situations. Now, to discuss capital punishment, we have Haley.
Capital punishment, specifically in the United States, is utilized in multiple states. And it is said that it is unconstitutional by the 8th Amendment and a failure to deter crime. Now, capital punishment is a cruel and unusual punishment due to painful and lengthy injections. Lethal injections are increasing the price throughout the years, and by changing to more expensive alternatives. By 2012, lethal injections were priced at $1,500 for each drug. And while capital punishment is proven to be a failure to deter crime, criminologists believe that it is an effective use of taxpayer money. Attorneys, prison wardens, and judges are present at hearings for death penalty cases, and they are all paid and funded by the state and federal government, provided by taxpayers. Death penalty cases are 2 to 3 times more costly than non-death penalty cases, and people of the public are starting to believe that life imprisonment is starting to seem as a better option than the death penalty. However, imprisonment is an issue in itself.
Okay, moving on to privatization of prisons.
Okay, so private versus public prisons. Now, using economically driven statistics and trends, we see that there's a business of private prisons, which is obvious because the private prisons are run of a separate entity than the government, whereas public prisons are run governmentally and run administrated that way as well. With that being said, it costs less for the government to use private prisons, but it costs more in terms of the ethicality and the poor quality of life to the prisoners that are housed there. Now, using an insight via an NPR source, a journalist went inside a federal private prison in Texas and found that there was an understaffing of the medical team, meaning that whenever prisoners got ill, they would face problems in recovery, and there was an understaffing of guards, meaning that assault rates were higher in that prison. Also, this all contributes to a poor quality of life in private prisons. Now, looking at this graph, we see the 2 major firms that hold the majority of the private sector prisons: the Corporation of America, Corrections Corporation of America, and the GEO Group. Now, as you can see, this is the profits that they gain each year, and it's 222 million and 139 million, which is over 300 million profits that are going into the pockets of stockholders and prison owners that are not going into the prisoners themselves.
Next, we're talking about the issues regarding drug sentences. So the logistics of prisons. Less than 1/4 of all people who are imprisoned and convicted of non-violent drug crimes stop using drugs and committing crimes once they are released. There have been multiple severe cases of withdrawal within prisons because of a lack of medical staff supervision. They just leave them in there, and it's a very dangerous side effect of the overcrowding of prisons, which again, almost half of all people being arrested, convicted, and imprisoned today are non-violent drug offenders. For economy, it costs $60,000 a year to keep one person in prison, which is a teacher's salary. And to put someone in a jury-mandated rehabilitation facility, it takes anywhere from $12,000 to $7,500 a year. The required sentence for a rehabilitation facility to be effective is 2 years. The minimum drug sentence for nonviolent drug offenders goes anywhere from 5 to 10 years.
All right, now that we've discussed the expenses of capital punishment, drug sentences, and privatization of prisons, let's delve into a few economically driven solutions that can hopefully cut unnecessary expenses. And these solutions exist in the larger context of government spending and national debt. First of all, this is the 2018 government spending statistic under Trump's administration. And if we reallocate funds to the Department of Justice, we could achieve a better proportionality of government funding. And this, of course, leads to an enhanced quality of life for not only the convicted but the incarcerated. So yes, we should recognize other departments' needs in the government system, and we should reallocate funds to ensure that we have the budget for basic quality of life. Secondly, we should prioritize national debt. Now, national debt is extremely detrimental to not only the government, obviously, but wallets of American taxpayers themselves. Now, if we prioritize national debt, taxpayers won't have to pay directly out of their pocket to contribute to decreasing the debt. And if our country is less in debt, in problem-solving crises, we can have a better budget to problem solve. We will also improve our debt to GDP ratio, which is a ratio of our government debt to our GDP, or gross domestic product, which is measured in years. Now, a low debt to GDP ratio indicates that a country is able to produce and sell goods and services sufficiently enough to not further incur debt. We as Americans do not have a low debt to GDP ratio. In fact, according to the World Bank, the tipping point for a debt to GDP ratio is 78%. We as a country are at 77%. And if we prioritize national debt, lastly, we will of course achieve innovative budgeting.
Okay, so when discussing our two solutions which suggest to prioritize national debt and reallocate funding, there are limitations. So starting off with prioritizing funding towards national debt, the problem there is that whenever you're prioritizing national funding, you're shifting focus to national debt, but that focus is being shifted from other funding, such as like infrastructure or other government-run programs. Now, moving on to the reallocation of funds. Whenever you're moving around money, you're moving it around to new people, and that's not to say that these people aren't experienced or anything, but that's to say that this is a bigger responsibility, and they're gonna have to deal with it. So that kind of makes room for people who can be corrupted or abuse it or not handle it correctly. And those are the only two limitations for.
Going back to a limitation of national debt, turning back funds for infrastructure, an example of that would be Hurricane Harvey. We were recently hit by Hurricane Harvey, and if we prioritize national debt, a limitation to that would be there would be less government funds to improve the consequences of Hurricane Harvey in our city, unfortunately. And historically speaking, Texas has actually in the past reformed its criminal justice method so that national debt is decreased. For example, a lot of incarcerated people in prison were actually released, and because of that, we have observed a trend in which the more people are released and put back into the workforce, the more actually income would be produced. So, thank you. Thank you.
So, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers, of course, that you decided to not include in the presentation?
Okay, so we did not include Annie's and Christian's arguments based on jury reevaluation and police brutality, because although they had a compelling argument that tied their arguments together about how race plays a factor in the justice system, they did not hold a majority, as in the solution that we could create could not hold a majority of us. When looking at the solution that we came up with, it covered the problems that me, Aaron, and Haley all faced, whereas the solution that would be made from that would only cover Christian and Annie, which would be not good.
Okay. So, Christian, how did the group decide to include Aaron's perspective in the conclusion?
Since we kind of decided on the economic lens, Aaron's pretty much fit in there because there was a lot to do with money, and it really related to everyone else's pretty strongly. So.
All right. So, and what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
It definitely painted a much broader picture for what I expected my solution to have. I didn't expect for such big changes to have impacts on the problems with drug sentencing such as mine. It made me approach the solution to my problem in a different way.
Okay. So, which one of your teammates had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem?
Probably Utom's argument was helped me understand it better because it really broadened my perspective on issues with the prisons and funding for prisons. So it really made me understand the economic issue of the U.S. justice system.
All right. Annie, how did Christian's research help you understand the topic?
Initially, he did research on the ethicality of a jury, which we did decide to exclude from the presentation, but in conclusion, he did research on the limitations to the solutions which we as a group configured. But his research, he looked at trends from history, such as reforms in Texas, and he just looked at statistics and trends through history rather than numbers themselves, which I think is a greater effect on the argument at hand, which is how change is created through these big impacts.
Okay. All right. Thank you.